So before Dr. Kohonen, gets started, just indulge me for 5 minutes because I want to have a little fun with you and also to, set the context of the discussions that are going to be taking place today. So as you can see, yeah, I wanted to share some good news. I have finally managed to complete my manuscript on wealth power and the architecture of avoidance. And this is a book that is directed towards Judy Flix, the people of Judy Flix, the revenue authorities, to be able to look at how do you identify a high net worth individual and then track them to assess whether they have been tax compliant or not. So when this is out, I will let you know. I would love to hear your feedback on it. Of course, all mistakes in the book are mine going forward. And like I said, today we had a really good time with commercial law. Some of the students may be joining us for class today. Our guest lecturer, you know him, he's a familiar face in Kenya, Professor Wajakoya, and he brought in a very interesting topic. He tied the aspect of criminality and immigration together, calling it crimigation and the paradox of immigration control in a globalized world. So it was a really, really nice lecture that we had with him today for our third years. So now we have also spent a lot of time starting, I think, when we started the class, on international tax law, we've been doing some genuinely heavy intellectual lifting, right? We have been asking questions like, how does a state say this money is mine? How does it build laws, treaties, and rules to grab its share of value from businesses and people that are operating cross borders? And more interestingly, how does it give that power away? Sometimes accidentally, and sometimes because someone in a very expensive suit lobbied so hard with the government for you to do so. And if you remember our lecture on harmful tax incentives, this is exactly where it fits in. We have looked at the rules, how they're applied, how they're misapplied, and frankly, how also that they're abused. Now, in the middle of all this is something called illicit financial flows, IFFs, right? Now, the word illicit, I don't know, it can sound very dramatic and very criminal, and also it can sound very law and order, and sometimes it is, but there is also an uncomfortable question around this. So, say if I am a massive corporation and I use perfectly legal contracts, perfectly legal treaties that have been drafted so well by Judy and Nixon and Lennox, for example, and a very clever accountant to move profits to a tiny island where I pay almost nothing in tax. The question is that illicit? Because I have broken no law. My lawyers are celebrating, but the government of the country where I actually made that money is sitting with an empty budget and a broken school system, just like this picture that you're seeing here. Let me go back. You see, this is the state of our university at the moment. Since 2005 and 9, when I was a student there, it's the same infrastructure that even the current students and yourselves are looking at. Yeah. So the question is, right? I have broken no law. The accountants have helped me figure out how the Income Tax Act, the VAT, customs excise apply for me to be able to minimize and almost eradicate any tax I owe the government. And the question is that illicit or not? And you have a lot of scholars who genuinely disagree around this topic, and this is a heavily contested territory. And that is precisely what makes it such an electrifying area of research that you should consider if you will be doing your dissertations going forward. But now I also want to ask you something that sounds absolutely ridiculous. What does a fish have to do with any of this? Samaki, sindio. Now, there is this quote I love. I actually love it because it resonates with what Dr. Matti Kohonen is going to discuss with us. And it says, if I fished only to capture fish, my fishing trips would have ended long ago. And if you read that again, the fisherman is not really there for the fish, right? So why is he there? Now think about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, the abbreviation of it, which sounds like a bureaucratic term, but is actually one of the most sophisticated financial crimes on the planet. A fishing vessel, it sails, think about it, imagine it, into the exclusive economic zone of the Indian Ocean, for example. No license, no declaration, no taxes, no royalties paid to that government. Now the fish get caught, shipped off, and sold into the international markets. And then the money flows through shell companies, mispriced yani trade invoices, and flag of convenience registries in jurisdictions that ask very few questions. So the fishing state, maybe like Kenya, gets nothing. Its fish are gone. Its fiscal base is eroded. And the operator was never really fishing for fish, were they? They were fishing for the margin, for the gap between what it costs to extract and what can be made when you structure the entire operation to avoid every legal and fiscal obligation that would eat into your profit. So that is an illicit financial flow. Whether it fits neatly into a legal definition or not, the money moved, the state lost, and someone very far got really rich. And I think that is what we're going to be exploring this evening. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Matti Kohonen. Dr. Kohonen is the director of the Financial Transparency Coalition. He's a founding member of the Tax Justice Network back in 2002, and someone who has spent over 20 years following the money across fisheries, forests, pandemic budgets, and care systems. And he's been asking the question, who is really losing and why? So Dr. Matti, he holds a doctorate from the London School of Economics, and he is the editor of Writing the Economy towards people, towards a people's recovery from economic and environmental crisis. This book, Dr. Matti actually gave me a few copies when I met with him sometimes back, and a few of these copies are available at our library in Parkland. So if you get a copy, please go ahead and read it. It was published in 2024. And he has been at the front lines of the UN financing for development process and has produced some of the sharpest source-based analysis on illicit financial flows in the fisheries and forestry sectors that exists anywhere in the literature. So last week we had Nixon Amundi, who was brilliant. Today we have Dr. Kohonen, who is extremely brilliant as well. And Dr. Kohonen, without much further ado, I want to hand over the floor to you. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence today. Over to you.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. I hope you can hear me well. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I would like to be there in person. And in the occasion of the UN tax negotiations, that indeed is one of the possibilities as well, to meet at those occasions, now that some of the power and the location of making rules has started to shift towards the global south, and Nairobi in particular. Thank you for the introduction. I'm very humbled, but it is an intellectual pursuit of mine to find where the money goes in the world and to advance transparency. My doctorate touched on the cocoa sector in Ghana, and I was intrigued ever since about how money moves between the global north and the global south. But I will today be talking about mostly about fisheries and forestry as high-risk sectors regarding illicit financial flows, and then some of the solutions that relate to transparency that could be potentially ending some of these IFFs and calling for sector-specific studies of illicit financial flows. We've all heard the big figures of illicit financial flows, I hope, of 89 billion according to UNCTAD, or indeed over 100 billion a year, according to Global Financial Integrity from Africa. But it's important to contextualize these figures and to look at sectors and look at the dynamics of trade and business within those sectors. So let me jump into some of my slides. If I could send a request for sharing and then having a look. And there we go, tracking, there we go, that's the one. And then let's go to the presenter mode. Okay. There we go. That should be visible. So tracking and tackling illicit financial flows, I thought I'd make a mouthful of that, because it's important not to just look at the big numbers, although they are very important. It's also important to actually see where they come from. And there we go. First of all, the definitions are very important. There is now a methodological guide for defining illicit financial flows since 2020. However, that methodological guide isn't universally being used by all institutions. But to recap on the methodological guide, as Leila also mentioned, some activities that are considered legal, like aggressive tax avoidance, are considered as illicit financial flows since 2020. And that's quite a new development. And it's not being fully implemented. They're in piloting phase at UNCTAD in rolling this out. And a certain number of African countries are being assisted by UNCTAD in looking at tax-related illicit financial flows. And the other aspect of illicit financial flows are more crime or illicit market-related illicit financial flows. And that may often relate to what UNODC, so the UN Office for Drug and Crime, analyzes as either drug-related or arms-related illicit financial flows. And most of the pilot countries for that are in Latin America and the Caribbean. However, I'll make an argument that actually the two overlap significantly, because what we actually have when we see things like trade mispricing is an unknown factor. We don't know the motive behind those who misprice trade or misdeclare trade. And the motives, while they may be related to not having a license or not being allowed to fish or log or mine in certain territories, or it going undeclared, it might also be tax related due to import-export taxes, corporate taxes, or indeed royalties. So that's where the definition is. So I would argue that illicit fishing, illicit logging actually is situated in the illicit tax and commercial practices more so than in the illegal markets, where the entire activity is illegal, such as drugs and guns. And I'm not here tackling too much on the exploitation or corruption-related IFFs. Those are motives, but they're not here discussed as much. So as I said earlier, UNCTAD considers that 89 billion is lost per year on trade mispricing related illicit financial flows out of Africa. If we look at Tax Justice Network's tax-related IFF estimates, we can break down their 6 years of figures to an annual figure that comes to about 6.6 billion per year for multinational companies' profit shifting activities. However, the trade mispricing figures, if we take it down to some sectors, UNCTAD and UNODC did a study on the mining, oil and gas sectors and estimated 27.8 billion a year, mostly on trade mispricing again. As at FTC, we've been looking at fisheries and forestry sectors lately, and here we've looked at the incidence of illegal, unreported and unregulated IUU fishing, and we see that about 50% of that can be located in Africa, and that would give about 11 billion of estimated losses for Africa, considering the global losses of 23.5 billion. And that's based on a methodology I'll cover in a minute, where you locate the reported fishing vessels that have been caught for IUU fishing, and then you just assume that each fishing vessel is of equal value in how much they produce. That's a bit of a simplified method, but that's currently the best method we can make. So this whole area is really an area of guesstimates, but as a method is published, it gets scrutiny, and hopefully we can improve the method every time we start to publish this work. In illicit deforestation, we've done a trade mispricing estimate, and we've looked at Cameroon only so far. And there we've noted a gap between import and export prices of 289 million per year over a 10-year period. So sectoral studies are interesting in IFFs, and I'll just jump right into the fishing. So here we see some of the biggest trade value gaps almost in any sector in terms of the relative trade value. I've looked at, for instance, the case of Seychelles, which is a major fishing nation. However, if we look at the Seychelles, they themselves only in their customs data that's available at UN Comtrade, you can only find 24 million of seafood exports under the custom code. But then when you look at the trade partners of what do countries importing from Seychelles report, you can find 296 million of imports from Seychelles. And what does that mean? That means that someone's misreporting. Someone is either representing Seychelles catch in the wrong way, or they're not reporting it at all. And there are, of course, explainable differences, which has to do with how customs are reported. So exports are reported without the cost of right and insurance, whereas imports have that. So it's the difference between those two methods of custom reporting. Some countries report both, and that usefully gives you a range of how much could be an allowed difference. So in this case of Seychelles fish export, the allowed difference could be about up to 14%. So we discount 14%, that may be generous. Some would discount only 10%, and still taking 14% off, we still have a gap of 230 million in the year 24. So that's quite a lot of money. And where would that be coming from? Some of the explanations by fisheries sector NGOs like Blue Marine, Environmental Justice Foundation, Global Fishing Watch, they tend to think that it has to do with the tuna fisheries. The Indian Ocean is a vast tuna fisheries area, and some of it comes from the high seas, so outside of territorial waters, but this would be something that's reported from the territorial waters. And it could be that it's misreporting either the type of tuna or overfishing the tuna that we have. So you have a license, but you overfish your license. And of course, the motives are either a lack of license or wishing to evade taxes on the tuna value that would otherwise be payable. And then the likelihood of getting caught is very low. Seychelles can't patrol its territorial waters. It's basically impossible to be present in such a vast territory. And that actually is true for all coastal nations. It's very hard to patrol them with the Navy or any other sort of vessels that the government has. You have to rely on satellite data. So all vessels up above a certain size need to have their automatic information system, or AIS, turned on. Well, they often turn it off when they go to marine protected areas, or when from the high seas they come to the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. They dip in fish and then they dip out. So it's quite easy to turn it off, and there are explanations and allowances for turning it off under maritime law, and they use these loopholes to fish in territorial waters. Even if you do happen to go to exclusive economic zones, it's allowed to pass through them, as it is allowed to pass through marine protected areas. So fishing in any marine protected area would be considered an illicit catch and an illicit financial flow, but you're allowed to transit through them. And that transiting, it's hard to prove whether you're fishing while you're transiting, because even obvious movements of vessels that look like fishing, circular movements, because certain nets require circular movements, or movements of back and forth, or long stays in the marine protected areas, would not be considered as illegal. It's hard to criminalize something where you don't have hard evidence. So sometimes what NGOs and governments have to do is to intercept them and try to catch a photo of them with a GPS coordinate, and that starts to become adequate evidence for IUU fishing. And then all the fish catch that's on board, if they can manage to intercept the vessel and bring it to port, would be considered as a sanction, as a sanctionable crime. However, what happens after that is that it's hard to trace the owners of these fishing vessels. So all fishing vessels, again, above a certain size, they need to have an International Maritime Organization number. So basically all industrial, semi-industrial fishing vessels need that. It's for insurance purposes originally, but it's also useful for tax and illicit financial flows purposes. And we can trace that because Lloyd's of London has the world's insurance database. Every vessel will be there. above a certain size. Also, we think that they are there, but sometimes the company owning the vessel isn't registered because it's not mandatory to register it. And this has to do with the gaps in rules and regulations. So if we'd make it mandatory to notify at least the legal owner of every company above a certain size, we would then be able to track some of the vessels who are coming into territorial waters, often illegally. Then after you know the company behind it, it's almost impossible to find the beneficial owner of the company. And I'll come to that in a few minutes. We only found that 16% of vessels caught for illegal fishing have a beneficial owner or shareholder assumed to be a beneficial owner that's traceable. As I said earlier, the Africa continent as a whole accounts for slightly over half of all IUU fishing instances. This may, of course, be that the NGOs and the governments are a bit more active in the African region on intercepting. It might be a bit easier, but still, this is the best method for geographically locating where the 23.5 billion could be sourced from. And therefore, we estimate that 11.2 billion of IUU fishing comes from Africa. And certain countries in themselves might be quite high as well. So Argentina also has a high loss of 2 billion, as does Indonesia. But as a continent, Africa loses the most, and almost all of that's West Africa, about 9.5 billion. Somalia being the other part of Africa that has a high instance of reported IUU fishing. Who's doing it? Well, a lot of the media attention was on the fact that indeed it is Chinese vessels that are the most intercepted. But then if you count all the others together, there are actually more. China does not, if you like, have the monopoly of illegal fishing. Spanish, Korean, Taiwanese, Thai vessels are also constantly being named in different reports for IUU fishing. And therefore, we consider it very much a global problem, even though 4 or 5 Chinese companies dominate individually the instances of IUU fishing. And then if you take it to a company level, we can break it down to which companies. And here you can see, while there's a large number of Chinese companies, we also see quite a few companies such as Pescatún in Colombia. Fishing and Cargo Services is, I think, a Panamanian company. So we do see companies internationally among the top 10 companies responsible for IUU fishing. And we published this back in 2022, so this is completely public. How do companies hide their ownership? It's important sometimes to hide your ownership if you don't want to be personally incriminated or sanctioned or fined or named for illegal practices. So we found that this was the simplest graphic to show how the global fishing industry works. It happens to be a Russian company registered in Spain. And we assume it's a Russian company because the trade unions told us that when a worker was in distress, the managers were based in St. Petersburg. We could not trace it on paper to Russia. So the vessels themselves are often owned within the countries where the fish is sourced, or in a tax haven. But we can see that the vessels operated in West Africa here were flagged in Cameroon, Cook Islands, St. Kitts Nevis, Cameroon, Angola, and St. Kitts Nevis. So that's where the flag is. The flag determines your labor rights position, some of your environmental regulations, and to some extent your tax position, but not really, because it's the parent company who pays the taxes, and there's very small fees payable to the country that provides you the flag. In international seas, you can have almost any flag, but sometimes some countries now require the flag of the country be flown if you want to access fishing rights. And that's why I think we see a bit more Cameroon and Angola here. But when we traced where that vessel that actually fished somewhere was owned, we found that it's all owned by 4 Belize companies. And that's where the ownership chain went a bit dark. We couldn't find the actual owner. We could find that they called port in Las Palmas, Canary Islands, Spain. So that's where an operating company was found. We also found that a company that had a similar name was based in Latvia, but it couldn't be linked together. So we couldn't conclusively put them together. But because of the workers in distress not being paid or not being allowed to come to port or other signs of distress, we traced it back to Russia. But indeed, it's the secrecy that allows companies to get away with illegal fishing, as well as forced labor offenses of type in the industry. Here's a Spanish company. So the complexity in the fisheries industry is really, huge. And it's very hard for any authority. And this company is one of the largest fisheries companies in Spain, in Europe, called Albacora. And they have, hundreds of fishing vessels. Some of them were named for IUU fishing. And their ownership structure could not really be traced to a final owner, but we could see that there was some of the shareholders of Albacora SA could be found as a legal entity that was most responsible for these. And again, here we see the two-tier structure of first fishing vessels having a certain flag, and then there's an intermediary jurisdiction where you tend to shift profits, most likely in our assumption, as well as hide ownership details. And then we come to the parent company. The parent company doesn't seem to own these directly. So we have a high incidence of secrecy jurisdictions as vessel owners, whether it's Curacao, Panama, as well as Seychelles. And then we have a number of vessels that are owned at the source countries, in this case, Tanzania being one of the vessels, as well as Ecuador. Now, then it goes back to Spain and the complex structures of two companies that in the history merged as well. So there's a complexity that comes from corporate mergers as well. So yeah, I like tracing these ownership trees. This is done with quite an expensive software called Orbis, owned by Moody's, which is now mostly known for its credit rating agencies, but it also has the most extensive database of company ownership. So if you want to do that research, try to get a license somewhere. But we found it at the British Library. It's hard to find a license, basically. Some universities have it. So the conclusion on illegal fishing or illicit fishing is it's incredibly difficult to trace. The losses seem to be very large and concentrated in Africa. And the best recommendations, and I'll come at the end, is really to require the registration of the legal owners and the beneficial owners of all fishing vessels who do get a fishing license. So there's a port, if you like, there's a gatekeeper role that governments play in providing fishing licenses. In many ways, they are like mining licenses. In the mining sector, it's a much better known ask that we need to ask for the beneficial owner of the companies who get a mining license, but we also need to consider fisheries, and I'll argue in a minute, forestry as similar extractive sectors, where we need to ask for just both legal and beneficial owner of the licenses. Next, we're going to jump into the forestry sector, and our case study here in Africa is Cameroon, where we've studied the issue. In Latin America, we've also studied Brazil, which I won't cover here. Cameroon has both a large gap, as I explained earlier, of the trade value gap of 289 million per year on its timber exports compared to imports, minus the explainable differences in customs reporting. And it's very difficult to determine illegal logging. Satellite data, however, today exists to know exactly where logging takes place. And that's the FAO and other international bodies have started a portal called Global Forest Watch. So we know where logging takes place. Governments also provide, including Cameroon, quite a good amount of data on logging licenses. So we know who has a logging license, where, and we actually know the boundaries of the logging license. And we also know who, as a company, has the logging license. And we can map those. So we can map the illegal, the logging versus license, but we can't actually determine whether, based on this source-based method, whether we have illegal logging. So here's, first of all, the trade value gap between Cameroon and China, so which was up until recently the main destination of Cameroon's timber. Cameroon has now a 60% export tax on raw logs, so they want to capture more of the value added since recent years, and has pushed, therefore, all timber companies to process the wood within the country and to export processed timber, so planks of timber rather than logs. And that has now shifted the export a bit more towards the EU because the Chinese prefer the raw logs, but both import both types of logs. But the trade value gap with Europe has therefore become the major trade value gap. So Europe imported about 300 million, and now the Chinese ones are down to 200 million. And Cameroon reported about 200 million of exports in 23. So there's a 100 million gap between those two, explainable to a certain extent of 8 to 10%. Beyond that, unexplainable. Where could that be coming from? So the only way to understand that is to try to have a better understanding of where the timber is sourced based on satellite data, we believe, and based on timber concession data. But the bit that's missing in the timber data is that we can't say how much a certain timber concession produced timber. So that we don't know. And we don't really know how much was produced outside of them. So if we could have better land data and better logging data, we could get closer to that answer. But what we do know is that based on Cameroon's publicly available data on sanctions and fines, certain number of companies have been getting in recent years fines for illegal timber. And we can also find out that they still get timber licenses. So here's one of the companies called Bilco. This is a subsection of the map of the entire country for all timber concessions, and also we mapped the palm oil concessions. And most of the forest, most of the timber comes from the red part, which is sales or standing volume. Those are auctioned. So if you win the auction, you can harvest timber there, or communal forest, which is the dark purple. And in this case, a auctioned sales or standing volume was won by Bilco, which was, according to Cameroon's own data in 21 and 22, sanctioned for illegal logging. And then you could trace the customs data to see if Bilco had exported, but there the trace goes dark, if you like, because they won't export directly in many cases. They'll have an export handler. That is the next part of the export processing chain. So we need to know more about the supply chain to know whom did Bilco export. So this makes it almost impossible to trace illicit timber in the destination countries, because we don't know the chain of invoices where the illicit timber in this case goes. Also, we'd have to prove that that timber shipment indeed came from an illicit plot, but it provides quite a good, if you like, methodology for government agencies to start tracing the illicit timber here. Impact. In some cases, it is traceable. In the fisheries sector, it's the vessels of quite a large company that illicitly fish the world's oceans. And then we can name the company and we can say that they're the top company or the top 3 of companies. And one company that we named and others named, called Pingtan Maritime Enterprise, was sanctioned, and that led to them being delisted of the Nasdaq exchange. And that also led them to lose some of their markets and some of their licenses. Similarly, the EU had considered that because in some estimates, half of Cameroon's timber exports came from areas without a license, and they also terminated some timber agreements, but that hasn't stopped the timber export. So that was just a timber monitoring agreement with the EU, but that hasn't actually stopped the timber exports like we saw in some of the earlier slides. So what would actually help is that if the importing countries would pay more attention to national fines and national sanctions, and if they would work with the source countries to try to find out whether a plot of land, whether a concession is harvested or over-harvested rather for timber, and then to see how much that overharvesting is and which companies are responsible for that. We have the logging data in this case, just like in the fisheries sector. There's a similar project called Global Fishing Watch. You know exactly where all of the global fishing vessels are at any point of time, but you don't know how much they fish and you don't know where they export. So locating vessels and locating timber today is possible with satellites and automatic systems of tracing them, but locating the economic value is much harder. Because there's commercial secrecy. We don't seem to think that it's proportionate to ask companies to disclose these transactions, partly because of privacy concerns. And that's also why we no longer, at least in Europe, have access to beneficial ownership registries, because it was considered as a disproportionate infringement of privacy to have access to BO registries in a 2022 European Court of Justice decision that invalidated public access to BO registries. That hasn't, of course, stopped for other countries having public access, including Ghana legislated public access, as did Nigeria, and the UK outside of the EU now still has public access to beneficial ownership. However, just having BO access isn't enough if we also can't link BO to sanctioned companies, fined companies, or companies that overlog and overfish. So our previous asks as the tax justice movement and financial transparency movement was to say that we need beneficial ownership and asset ownership information access. Now I would say that we need to link that to environmental crimes, to human rights crimes, and companies overexploiting natural resources. And we need to work with the data providers and the civil society and academia working in those sectors to better link it to the actual crimes and abuses that happen in the corporate sector to then stop them. And despite seizures of timber, despite seizures of fish, the industry goes on. So there hasn't been a noticeable dip, despite naming environmental crimes and human rights crimes in these sectors, of the exports or estimates of the illicit activity in these sectors. In fact, any estimates of IFFs are still on the upward trend, and the current regulatory and legal changes in terms of transparency, information exchange, haven't really dented that trajectory. We would hope that by doing this work, the trends would start to go down. So concluding, I would say that looking at high-risk sectors to build an argument for public access to ownership data is an important avenue in the next few years. We've lost the general access, at least in Europe, and also in the Financial Action Task Force, there isn't really an appetite for making the beneficial ownership registries fully publicly accessible at the moment. And that's the global anti-money laundering regulator. We hope that in the UN tax convention process, we would get some indication that it's the preferred option to have public access to beneficial ownership registries to combat tax avoidance and tax abuse. And maybe we could get a mention for high-risk sectors, either in the UNTC or indeed other processes, to say those are, if you like, of even greater urgency and importance to ensure public access to ownership in sectors like fisheries, forestry, mining, oil and gas, where a lot of the focus on IFFs has been. And then I guess it also goes together that we need to make sure that we have the sector-specific studies that show that if I don't have access to IUU fishing data, so many governments don't publish the list of vessels they fine or sanction for illegal fishing. Senegalese NGOs asked this many times, and the government won't publish it. There are fines. I guess the reality is that many of the fines are settled out of court, and they would maybe want to keep some of the companies to continue fishing in their waters because they provide some revenue and they provide some employment as well in the countries where they fish. So not to name and shame them, that would make the companies leave. We'd argue that it's better to publish those names, and then maybe after a few years, We consider that if they've improved their practices, we no longer name and shame them. But to not know who's behind these crimes makes it really incredibly difficult to research them. Some countries like Argentina did publish during the previous government the list of IUU vessels, as have some of the other countries who we've asked. So it is possible to publish, and there's no legal impediment to publish sanctioned and fined vessels. And that's mostly it. My recommendations are that as students, if you're thinking of your research or your thesis, doing sectoral studies of illicit financial flows, trying to look at the sectoral trends, I think would be a really exciting area of IFF research, because we know the continental economy-wide figures, but we don't tend to know either the sectoral figures based on statistics, nor do we really trace down to the company level, fishing vessel level, or forestry concession level, the IFFs that are potentially taking place. Yeah, there you go. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matti. That was very engaging to be able to understand and listen to what illicit financial flows are in the context of, the fishing. And of course, today in our class, we just don't have our master's students who are, conversant with the global tax rules. But I notice we also have some undergraduate students who have shown an interest to join this lecture just to hear about illicit financial flows. So it's really been engaging. We've got to hear statistics and facts, and we've got to look at the way in which this IUU regime around IFFs is shaping and being built around the African continent going forward. So before we have an engagement between Dr. Matti and I, because I have some questions for him as well, I'm opening up the floor to all of you. If you have any questions, please ask. If you need a clarification, if you want Dr. Matti to repeat a particular point, or you just want to give feedback, now is your chance. Please just unmute yourself or raise your hand, and then we can have that discussion for now. So it's on your fort now, students. Okay, so what I'll do is that probably, Dr. Matti, I'll ask you a question. So by then, maybe the students will have framed the questions that they may have, and then they could also engage us in a conversation. But because I'm working so much in the area of technology at the moment, I can't help but to think what happens when artificial intelligence enters this picture. So, I mean, AI today, it generates invoices. It can now also model optimal pricing structures across hundreds of jurisdictions at the same time. And AI can also identify gaps in the exchange of information regimes, faster than any human compliance officer. And AI can process trade data at a scale and speed that also makes traditional audit and detection methods look like someone is trying to catch Lewis Hamilton on a bicycle, right? So I'm trying to frame my question. Now, you have this sophisticated actor who is trying to deploy an AI in cross-border trade structuring. He's not breaking any law in the moment of doing it, but the effect is that capital has been extracted, the tax base has been eroded, the fiscal capacity has been diminished, and it's doing exactly what IFFs have always produced. So in the context of, artificial intelligence, robots, and AI agents basically entering, the fiscal space of our economies, my question to you would be, do we need to broaden the definition of illicit financial flows as a result?
I think the first part to answer that is that as researchers of illicit financial flows and as members of academia, we also need to use AI. This trade mispricing analysis was still done at hand. Copy pasting this cell by cell in Excel, that's really inefficient. That's only to better understand the data yourself, to refine your methods and to spot, if you like, inadequacies in existing statistical methods that take, if you like, blanket answers or blanket assumptions, and to question those assumptions. Once you've, if you like, mastered your copy pasting skills and understand the data and why it behaves in the way it does, then you'd really need to deploy AI to then mass analyze that. And that's, if you like, what I'm hoping to do next with the sectoral analysis of trade mispricing trends, because in each sector and each trading pair, you have different costs of freight and insurance. You have slightly different costs of value adding and value added patterns. And if you take those away, then you start to have the actual trade mispricing that's unexplainable. And the entire, if you like, criticism of trade mispricing is that you can always find an explanation for a type of an illicit financial flow. And that's how around 2017 and 18, the large figures of IFFs were discredited, and institutions like the World Bank and the OECD can still say that those are largely discredited because there's a few articles who've shown that there are outlier prices, that there are explainable exports that are completely outside of it, samples or different grades of gold, and therefore the whole literature is nonsense. Well, we need to be much better at that. The second part is really that indeed AI is driving now tax optimization strategies. It's driving company restructuring, and I think we've now seen the first times when AI starts companies and starts to file for companies without human intervention. I'm sure it's already happened, that AI is already starting to do company formations, because why would it not? Why would someone not do that if it's possible? And therefore robots are creating tax structures on their own, and they're starting to soon file their taxes on their own, driven of course by instructions of those who ultimately benefit from them. We should try to ban that. I don't know at the moment because of a precautionary principle. Make sure that there's always a human that files a company. Make sure that there's a passport and ID check of a human before a company is accepted to any company registry. And also make sure that any tax optimization strategy, at least for a larger company, could be make sure that it's a human who kind of makes a declaration for that there's a person behind that. Of course, they'll misdeclare those persons, but at least a person somewhere is filed. And as a result, we need to be in an AI arms race. We need to be detecting these structures with AI. So if it looks like AI, if it starts to look like an artificial structure, we should be trying to wind them down or inspecting them. But this then has to do, of course, with the lack of capacity and staff. Will AI require better staffing in tax administrations, especially in international tax functions? Probably yes. Do countries have those resources? Maybe not. So this is going to lead to, if you like, an arms race where maybe some of the countries can't keep up.
Sometimes a lot of food for thought for me to think through this entire concept, because I haven't really worked in the field of illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing, but it's so fascinating from the way in which you've explained, and it's so close to home because the Indian Ocean, where we which borders our own coastline, there must be a lot happening on that front, and we need to also be keen on the same. So colleagues, do you have any questions for Dr. Matti? Because I see one from Kiza. It's so nice to note that you've joined us, Kiza. And he's a good friend. We always chat on LinkedIn, and we also ended up meeting at one of the conferences here on the continent. So happy to see his message here. His question is basically, which is in addition to mine, Dr. Matti, is how do we handle data havens as they are now being earmarked to promote illicit financial flows, just like the traditional tax havens? So your thoughts on this, Doc?
Yeah, so data centers tend to concentrate in certain jurisdictions, and also, if you like, unless countries have strong data privacy laws, it's completely allowed to have consumer data, company data outside of the jurisdiction, and therefore you can't really request it from anyone because the data is somewhere else. And if the data laws of that other place are quite harsh, you won't get any access to that, even as a tax administration or an anti-corruption authority. So I think it is a problem. We need to update our exchange of information laws for the era of data center driven economies. And also we need to then consider what public disclosure we need. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We have Lennox who wants to ask a question. Please, Lennox, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Matti. I think two questions from my side. One is when I look at the fishing space and the forestry space across Africa, is it a question then of proliferation of a lot of retail traders who are then housed within a major, particularly for the forestry bit of it, a major company that would then be doing the logistics in terms of supply chain and what have you, that then takes away that because of the self-reporting mechanism that mostly we employ in, the taxation model across, largely across Africa. That would be one. And just looking at it from the supply chain and the AML and environmental, recommendation that you gave, trying to understand. Yes, I see the interlink between money laundering and the supply chain and environmental laws, and how that can ultimately lead to a full-fledged system. However, my query is, all these financial laws seem to be applying to different, distinct regulators, so to say. So are we calling for harmonization of the regulatory space to promote tax compliance then, such that then, as opposed to having, for example, me thinking outside the box, as opposed to having a financial reporting center that is keen on handling, money laundering, and having KRA that will focus on tax. But then we have that all under one limb, and then we have sub-limbs of sorts. So it's such that then, the transfer and exchange of information is smoother and leaner. Yeah, those are the first two. And then the other question, of course, is on the private companies and the query that, I have tried to think of a solution to the problem of finding new BOs. Unfortunately, the corporate veil is there for that specific reason, and the concept of the corporate veil. And my biggest challenge is, how then do we balance the privacy and the private operations of these private company vis-a-vis the compliance bit? I do get that from a legal compliance perspective, from a corporate law perspective, these companies have reporting obligations, for instance. But then this does not extend to, the scope that we want, so that we can satisfy some of these requirements. So maybe maybe for that, I'd just like you to clarify on what your vision would be as to how we can navigate the corporate veil system in tax law then.
Thanks, Lennox. Great questions. I'll start from the last one. On the corporate veil, since the FATF recommendation 22 was updated, all countries will now need to create centralized registries of beneficial owners in either already, as is the case of Kenya, the law is there, or in process. In some countries, it's still not yet there. So in that sense, the corporate veil is, if you like, broken. Already governments will know who are the beneficial owners. The next debate really is about whether either economy-wide or in high-risk sectors, we can have a differentiated approach of what is then publicly disclosed and what is not publicly disclosed, and what is the threshold for reporting beneficial owners, either to the government registry or to the public, or do you have different thresholds? So it's a live debate, really. I've seen one of the most interesting BL legislation in Africa is in Ghana, where high-risk sectors such as mining, financial services, politically exposed persons had a lower threshold of 5 to 10%. And then the economy-wide threshold was 25%. And the public registry is still not effective in terms of it's not searchable fully, but there's the intention of making it public according to those thresholds. It hasn't been challenged. It probably will be challenged if you think of legal challenges. But I think it's interesting that we see a differentiated approach. And I think that's taking the debate forwards to say that the debate between privacy versus anti-money laundering, tax, and environmental and human rights crimes, I would say that there's a long list of crimes, although environmental crimes and human rights crimes are also predicate offenses for money laundering in most places, but still useful to make the whole list. kind of tips the balance in some sectors more towards public disclosure than other sectors. And that balance may need to be contextualized to every country. Indeed, one of the problems is that AML authorities have their own access to data. Tax authorities have their own access to data. Some laws on beneficial ownership disclosure don't allow access to tax authorities because it's considered an anti-money laundering legislation, whereas access to information law on offshore accounts might only be accessible to tax authorities because it's considered a tax law rather than an anti-money laundering law. So that's why having a unified framework for IFFs actually makes a lot of sense. And then it's a matter of seeing who within a government need to have access to this data and how they coordinate efforts between each other. Also, we start to see the creation of industry-specific BO registries, such as in the fishing sector or in the extractive sector, that don't link back to the centralized BO registry of the country. That centralized registry should be of higher quality because you tend to have verification and also a ministry behind it who tends to understand the business sector and tends to understand trade and commerce. Whereas if a fisheries sector ministry starts a fisheries BO registry, they wouldn't really necessarily be the right people to run the BO registry. So they wouldn't be able to scrutinize that in adequate sort of level of detail. So that's why I'm saying is that you would need to have an IFF approach by a government. And then as a whole of government think what then needs to be also public. Indeed, some sectors have longer supply chains. We've discovered that in the timber sector, that somebody extracts it, and then especially if it's not exported as a raw log, it then gets processed, and then the process might be logistically moved by another company. So the invoice that's in the customs database, either at UN Contrade, where you don't get company names, but you can go to commercial databases like Export Genius or other companies that have the company names, and you'll find the logistics company exporting rather than the timber extraction company exporting, and you don't have the intermediate supply chain. So there's an issue in, if you like, customs reporting, is that you get the very last handler at port rather than the actual source of the goods. And that then you can't link it to the tax crime, environmental, human rights, or other AML types of crimes. Therefore, supply chain transparency also interacts with tackling illicit financial flows. If you don't know the supply chain either in the source country or indeed in the destination country, the supply chain there might also be quite long. You can't really tackle the reasons why they may be either an explained or unexplained discrepancy. Yeah.
Thanks, Matti. So, Maina, do you want to ask your question directly, or do you want me to read it out? Okay, so I assume he wants me to read it out. So his question is, given that sanctioned timber consistently reaches the US and the EU, where is the enforcement gap? At the port of export, transit, or import? Second, in the Kenyan context, Kenya is both a transit hub and a destination for timber, especially from Congo. Where is her enforcement chain breaking down? And then third, to what extent would the EACCMA, I don't even know what that is, facilitate the movement of sanctioned timber across EAC borders? And he says he's not in a position to vocalize. Over to you.
Yeah, so this is another feature that really needs to be researched more. We came across the transit versus source country issue in also Cameroonian timber, and Cameroon is also a transit country, Douala being the main port of timber from the Central African Republic, to some extent Republic of Congo, and to some extent other countries. But there is really a question in to what extent are the Africa-wide statistics of illicit financial flows reflecting transit country misreporting, or to what extent is it source country trade misinvoicing, trade mispricing, transfer mispricing that we're seeing? And therefore, the only solution really is to try to have better reporting of timber and other commodities transiting, and make sure that that data is available to all governments and to at least aggregate level, if not company level data. I also always like company level data, but as much of the data be made public in trade portals. So you can probably find that exporters from Congo to Kenya will not have any incentive to report that, because they would maybe be payable. They need to maybe pay some certain customs duties on that transit border. And then often that export from Kenya to the outside world is also unreported. The reason is, for the exporter, it might be considered, well, that's a transit timber, so that doesn't get reported under Kenya. So it might actually disappear from the statistic and only appear at the destination country as a Kenya import. And then you will have a large gap of Kenya import and Kenya export, because the local methods of custom declaration exclude the transit timber and also may well exclude the cross-border export from Congo to Kenya due to misreporting. So then where do we solve that? It's at getting the regional customs indeed community reporting at a better stage. I'd also say that much like fishing vessels, timber needs very large trucks. So those trucks could have a transponder like large fishing vessels, and we could be, on a live feed looking at where timber trucks are going. That would give us great data. They already have those transponders, because for fleet management, just like for fishing vessel management, you need those things. I guess the question is, at what point, of ton of weight of a truck would you make every single truck visible? But that would be a great exercise of transparency, to make all transport vehicles above a certain size publicly accessible, and make sure that their transponders are publicly viewable.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Matti. In fact, we have a question from Afshin Nazir. Afshin, it's good to know that you have a question beyond taking tea during the time of class. Go ahead.
Wow, Madam Leila, spreading secrets here. Anyway, I have two questions. One is on the UN Tax Convention process. I'm trying to connect that with the subject today. And I did read from the November negotiations that we were having for the convention that there was an article which was speaking about India and the Africa group calling for aggressive tax avoidance being part of the definition of IFFs, but global north countries opposing that. And I'm just wondering if the UN convention, it adopts a narrow criminal-only definition of IFFs, doesn't that effectively legalize the drain of wealth from the global south through transfer pricing in sectors like logging? And how can the UN reconcile this with its goal of fair allocation of taxing, right? If some of these common drains aren't technically a crime, but a legal accounting trick. And then on the second question, it relates to a case I saw that's recently going on at the EACJ, where South Sudan has taken 12 billion euro loan that's backed by the country's oil, and the pricing of the oil is really low, about $10 per barrel. And essentially it is a resource-backed loan, so it's more in the debt space. I'm trying to look at it from the tax angle. So regarding that South Sudan extractive sector, specifically these oil for loan agreements, if these contracts are structured to intentionally undervalue the resource so that we bypass domestic tax obligations, now would the UN conventions proposed protocols, can they classify this as a tax-related IFF, or does it fall under maybe the scope of debt-related IFF, or just the corruption bucket in general? Is there any way that could be connected to tax-related IFFs? Thank you.
Both are excellent questions. I'll take the second one first. There's been increasing number of resource-backed loans in recent years, especially for countries that lack full market access to so-called Eurobonds. Having resource-backed loans gives them an access to external lending, but then the terms, especially if they fail to pay the loan are onerous because they'll be losing much of the value of some of the natural resources that they export. In this case, indeed, the oil is mispriced, I would say. $10 per barrel is well below the average of last 3-5 years. Now it's above 100, actually. It was around 70. Of course, that then creates, if you like, that may be considered in the debt market as an, if you like, a risk premium or anything of that sort. But that also can, if it materializes, that sort of a resource that needs to be used to back a potentially unpaid loan, then that would, in my view, constitute an illicit financial flow because it's so undervalued. And then the country would need to export the oil at that price, and then that certainly pops up as a trade mispricing. And then that would be even a statistical measure of illicit financial flows, according to the UNCTAD guide. In the UN tax convention negotiations, we did not agree to work on the protocol on illicit financial flows for now. IFFs are likely to be mentioned in the main body of the convention, and we hope that they'll be mentioned according to the broad definition. That's the UN approved definition. It would be rather odd for a UN process to have a definition that the UN itself any different definition than what the UN itself has endorsed elsewhere. Of course, the global north countries in the negotiations will possibly kind of support the definitions that they have. And because illicit financial flows is defined by the UN, the northern countries now tend to use illicit finance as a different term with a different definition to only really look at illicit markets and corruption-related IFFs and terrorist financing. So even taking away the commercial IFFs, i.e. trade mispricing normally being the measure of that, or tax avoidance, aggressive tax avoidance related IFFs, which is then part of the UN definition as well. So the whole gray zone and the avoidance zone is taken out. And then they create laws based on illicit finance being the problem. And that's the US and the UK. European Union uses IFFs, maybe a legacy of Europe-Africa Union cooperation is there visible, but then the European Union's way of implementing it tends to be according to their own narrower definition. So there will likely be a disagreement on the definitions once we get to that protocol, post 27, and then we hope that with greater evidence and negotiations, we'll go back to the UN definition in the UN process. And it was the African countries who wanted the IFF protocol as an early sort of 27 protocol, but the negotiations concluded that digital economy taxation and issue of dispute resolution are to be the early protocols instead.
Thank you so much. And that was a very good question and sets a very good tone to have the discussion flow into the next class when we will be discussing a little bit about illicit financial flows and then base erosion and profit shifting, because that's also where the dichotomy is bringing about some differences going forward. I don't know if there are more questions. I don't see anything on the chat, but Dr. Matti, I mean, thinking like a lawyer now, as I was having this discussion in the morning about Morocco and Western Sahara, and this question has just, come into my mind, because when we speak about illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, the question usually is illegal according to whose law, and then regulated by which state, and of course reported to whom. And if we look at the Morocco scenario, right, Morocco has signed fisheries access agreements with the EU. And then, of course, under those agreements, I believe the EU vessels, they would fish in the waters that Morocco administers. And, the richest fishing grounds in that region apparently sit on the coast of Western Sahara, which is a territory that the International Court of Justice, the Africa Union, and also the United Nations have consistently refused to recognize as part of Morocco. So you've got Western Sahara's internationally recognized representative body, it was not a party to this fisheries agreement between EU and Morocco, and the people of Western Sahara also did not consent to this, and the royalties do not flow to them. Yet it's the fish is there, and their fish is being extracted, and the licenses rather that were issued by a state whose sovereignty over those waters, to put it diplomatically, is deeply contested. So now, if a fishing license is issued by a state that does not have internationally recognized sovereignty over the waters in question, like Western Sahara right now, and the revenue from that license flows to Morocco rather than to Western Sahara, whose territory it actually is that and is that an illicit financial flow phenomena within this context?
That raises an overall question about illicit financial flows and then a specific question. So the overall question is, when you look at even the dichotomy of legal, illegal, you need to break it down by source, transit, destination, and to see whether it broke a law in any of those parts of the, if you like, the trade, tax, or commercial relationships. And often you'll find that actually at the source country, you tend to find laws that may have been broken, but the transit and the destination countries tend not to recognize source country laws as valid for, if you like. So we don't tend to recognize tax avoidance in another country as tax avoidance in our country. We don't tend to recognize also sanctions, and this is even worse. Well, it depends, but they're criminal. So often, if you illegally fish, even that's not recognized in another country as illegal fishing. So we don't tend to recognize each other's laws to begin with. And that creates, if you like, a mismatch, which allows for illicit financial flows once they manage to get out of the country to be within the scope of what's legal. Because what's illegal in other countries, basically, we don't care. And so that has to change. So that's if you like, it's the comparative illegality, legality. And therefore, the notion of illicitness can help us to define this borderline illegality, legality, as saying it violates an international norm. And even though violation of international norms may not be considered as illegal, but if it's a strong enough violation for us to classify that as illicit. And now that then allows us to come back to Western Sahara. We are violating an international norm. It may not be illegal in Morocco. It may not be illegal even in the transit country if it goes through a jurisdiction where the fish on paper moves, might not move in actual physical fact, nor does it constitute a crime in the European destination country. So in this case, it's legal on paper in all of those, but you're violating an international norm, and therefore I would argue that it starts to become an illicit financial flow.
Excellent.
It is, if you like, in the eye of those who produce statistics to say which norm do we consider in the scope of our analysis of IFFs.
That's perfect. I like that, triology, source, transit, destination, because that phraseology really helps bring context into understanding the legal norms around this entire area. Now, I think this is beautiful. So back to the students. If there is any question, now is your time, because Dr. Matti has given us enough of his generous time, and I would like to also allow him to go back to his family and have a nice day. So any further questions, just unmute and ask. If not, great. Okay. Oh, Judy Flicks. Perfect. Yes.
All right. I'll just go ahead and ask. It's a pretty easy question, I think. And it is based on Dr. Matti's research. In Africa, most African coastal states have limited capacity for, curbing illicit financial flows, especially in the fisheries sector. And just wanted to know, based on your research, what interventions have delivered the highest return in curbing illicit financial flows in fisheries? Is it tax reforms, customs control, or international cooperation frameworks? I don't know.
Thanks for the excellent question, Julie. So I would tend to say that law enforcement alone can't stop IUU fishing. There won't be enough coastal guards or Navy vessels to stop this. So we need an approach where we have some form of enforcement as a deterrent, so they can then intercept vessels. But we need a whole, if you like, approach based on both national transparency as well as international destination countries participating in this. And that means that if a foreign country like an EU country, in case of Morocco, if somebody gets a fishing license, the EU needs to make sure that the legal and beneficial owners of that company are published, and that they also publish, ideally, taxes paid in Morocco, so that we understand how much is paid on the catch, how much, so if you like, a simplified form of what's country by country reporting for large multinationals, but in high risk sectors, simplified CBCR should be also done in addition to beneficial ownership transparency, so that we would know that if they are in the right ballpark of paying their taxes and royalties for the amount of catch that they do. So yeah, I think there's only one country, Iceland, that makes, we'll have to verify if this is true, but Iceland certainly asks the fishing companies to publish their catch levels and publish the taxes paid in their country. So it is possible. It doesn't violate any law to ask that. But governments often don't ask for transparency, partly because they think that it'll make some of the foreign investors run away. Well, they won't, because if the fish is there, they'll come, and they tend to pay for access. It's just a negotiation of what's needed to access a resource that's unique to a certain country or territory.
Brilliant. I think then that is it. I want to take this opportunity, Dr. Matti. Thank you so much for making time to join us and to discuss this excellent part of your research. I hope we're going to see some of the students take this up during their dissertation level, and so we can have real data coming from the continent as well. And thank you so much for sharing your email address. I'm sure the students will be able to get in touch with you directly if they have any further questions or clarifications. On my end, I can't thank you enough, and we hope to be able to receive you should you come in November for the UN Framework Convention discussions, and we can have like a nice discussion at the university in person, which I think is always the best. So thank you so much. I will now allow you to leave us so that we can have a small discussion on the assessment that follows after, our class on international tax law.
Thank you. And international tax law is one of the most important developmental questions for both Kenya, wider African countries, as well as for us here in Europe, in ensuring that it's done responsibly. So carry on with your studies, and big thank you for Leila and for others for inviting me. Thanks.
Most obliged. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch shortly as well. Thank you. Great. Great, guys. So I hope that the last week's lecture from Mr. Omondi and today's lecture from Dr. Kohonen has been quite good for you to understand that beyond international taxation, there are different things that are happening. There are different ways in which key stakeholders are engaging with the global tax rules. You heard from Nixon. I mean, he's the chief manager when it comes to the Digital Economy Tax Office about what exactly they do. And now you're seeing what Matti is basically doing in terms of tracking the problem of illicit financial flows within this entire sector of fisheries. Of course, there's some multinational corporations that work within the fishery sector. If you read the fish leaks case of Angola, you're going to be able to get so much of information, not Angola, sorry, Namibia. That's where it basically happened, about how government officials were involved together with certain private sector elites in creating this huge conduit companies and shell nominee agencies around the world to be able to now come and conduct this illegal, unregulated and unreported fishing from Namibia, and the amount of money that was lost. This was uncovered by the international consortium of investigative journalism, the ICIJ. If you look at their website, you get to see these reports on the fish leaks case, and you understand the problem is so prominent in Namibia that we have to ask ourselves, countries like Eritrea, countries like Djibouti, even the problematic region of Somalia, and even the Indian Ocean, if you just go towards Watamu, what is really happening there? Is there illegal fishing taking place? Who's regulating that sector? I mean, there was a time I went to Watamu last year, and I was just walking around the fishing areas and just trying to question some of the fishermen about whether they have licenses. And basically, when they go to fish, where is it reported? And apparently in Watamu, they have this depot, right? It's supposed to be a government depot. Anybody who's now bringing back fish from the shores into, the hinterland, they have to go to the depot and report. And there's a government officer there with a book, a manual book, right? With a pen and a pencil, and he has to record the person who brought the fish, weigh it, and then also give it a price. And you could see a number of people come with fish, but not go towards the depot, go straight into private vehicles, put the fish there, and drive away. And the government officer is seated there, he's watching this, but he's not doing anything. So that raises the concern about, do we have research coming out of Watamu, for example, telling us about whether there is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing that's taking place? Djibouti has been at war for so long. I mean, the president there, who's today, if you go to Djibouti, there's a huge, like an advert on one of the polls, and he says, the only thing I pride myself is to make sure and is to ensure that Djibouti has had peace. And that's the only reason why he's remaining in power. He's been in power for quite some time. But the country is so depleted. I've not seen the kind of poverty that I saw in Djibouti anywhere in the world. But you've got almost 11 military reserves across Djibouti, and you have almost 120 multinational corporations in Djibouti, and Ethiopia already has built a free port on Djibouti's waterline. And you ask yourself, like, what is happening here? Because for a lawyer to be able to sit back and watch this landscape, you can immediately feel red flags. But the question is, where is the sovereignty of Djibouti? You're bringing 11 military stations in your country, 120 multinational corporations, and all of the 120 multinational corporations have been given zero tax, like a 10 years corporate tax holiday, which is extended, at the time of expiry for another 10 years. And when you look at the income inequality and the poverty in that country, it's even shooting up to 80%. People don't have housing, don't have clean water. There's no employment, right? People are now trying to build small box houses so that people can stop living, under plastic. That's how bad it is. So you ask yourself, that's the economic reality of this country, but it has a water source. But Ethiopia has claimed that water source at the free port. The military bases are there, and 120 multinational corporations are there. What's happening to the fish that's within the exclusive economic zone of Djibouti? And how does that impact, Eritrea? And how does that impact Somalia? Because it's all borderline towards that same particular region. So even when we talk about illicit financial flows, you need to understand that it doesn't just impact one country, right? It's a cross-border issue, and we really need to be aware about this. Now, in Google Classroom, you will see that I have uploaded recorded videos on illicit financial flows to give you some semblance about what really this topic is about. And I think Matti talked a lot about IFFs in the IUU sector, but now let's try and bring that towards what does illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing have to do with global tax rules? What does it have to do with international taxation? And basically, it has everything to do with transfer pricing, with treaty shopping, with permanent establishment, with beneficial ownership, with trade misinvoicing, and also with conflating exchange of information. Right? So think about it this way. You have a company that catches the fish and it sells it to its own sister company in another country at a fake low price. That way, the profit is appearing somewhere with very low tax, and the fish has moved, the money has moved, but the tax did not. That is a classic TP issue, transfer pricing issue. Then the second thing about what IUU has to do with global tax rules is that, these fishing companies are very clever about where they register themselves, right? They pick countries that have special tax deals with the coastal state. These are deals that were originally meant for something else entirely, so that even the little tax that should be paid, it gets wiped off completely because of a treaty. And that's where we talk about treaty shopping. And then even if the fishing vessel is sitting in your own waters for months and it's catching our fish, say in the Indian Ocean, the law as it currently stands may say it is not really there in a legal sense, right? There's no permanent base. There's no taxable presence. So the state watches, the fish just leave and it collects nothing. And that is where we need to think about permanent establishment rules under the OECD and the UN and try to now contextualize that in understanding how is this PE threshold created when you have a trawler who's been present on your waters for like maybe 7 months. Okay, then there's also the part about beneficial ownership, and that is related to global tax rules, right? Because nobody knows who actually owns the company. I mean, if you have registered a shell company, a postbox company, a conduit company, or you've gone to Liberia, which is a flag state, and you have basically registered a company in Liberia as a flag state, and you're not disclosing to Liberia that you're also a shell company or a conduit because Liberia's laws are governed by the law of Delaware in the US, etc. And it creates a problematic space because then ownership becomes very, very much opaque. So nobody knows who actually owns the company. It is registered somewhere, say with a fake director and a mailbox address. Then the government of the coastal state, it is not able to find the real owner. And if they cannot find the real owner, they can't even chase the money. And this is something very interesting, let me tell you. So I was in Liberia last year as well, and we were doing a mapping about, illicit financial flows from the tax element, not fishing and all that. And then what I found out is that, you see here in Kenya, we have the Business Registration Registry, our BRS, yeah? If you go to the BRS, it is owned by our government. Say, okay, the back-end technology, we have to pay royalties to whichever company software we are using, but it is owned by the government. And if you go to BRS, they'll be able to give you the data, of course, respecting the data protection laws. But funnily enough, in Liberia, their corporate register is not owned by Liberia. It's owned by the US. So even when the Liberian government wants to know how many multinational corporations or even domestic companies are registered in Liberia, they have to now request that information from the US. And you ask yourself, you're a sovereign state. The companies are registered on your land, and you can't even access that information because the register doesn't belong to you. Yeah. All the US does is that they pay, I think, about $100,000 or so every year to Liberia for allowing them to continue privatizing the corporate register. And I think during the time of John Allen Sirleaf, at that particular point, the US had asked the former Liberian president to allow them that autonomy over the company's register. And then by the time Ellen came into office, that agreement was about to now expire. And the US now requested for a continuation of being the only people with the autonomy to be able to control the register. And they allowed it. I mean, it's yeah, Judy, you're making that face. And that was my reaction as well. It's like here you come to Kenya and BRS tells you, we can't give you any data. You have to ask the South Africans because they are the ones who actually control our register. I mean, what does that mean for sovereignty? And then, of course, you have to understand the history and the political reality of Liberia to be able to know why this is basically happening. So in that context, who do you know? How do you know who owns the company, right? Because beneficial ownership has just been put in the trash bin. Then also, we talked about, trade misinvoicing. And trade misinvoicing has everything to do with the international tax law. So it's like, for example, the fish, it finally gets exported the paperwork says they are worth far less than they actually are. Say the kingfish is worth maybe £100, but now they say, oh, it's only worth £10, right? So the custom duties are very low. The declared revenues are low, and every calculation of what the state is owed is based on a line that is actually written down on an invoice. Yeah. And then finally, and I think this is also the most devastating one, right? Is that if the fishing was illegal and it was unreported to begin with, then it never appeared in any system at all. So there's no record, there's no invoice, there's no any tax return, nothing. And therefore you cannot tax what you cannot see, because the fish, it never officially existed, neither did the money that has been made from selling that fish. So even if the revenue authority is to now write to another revenue authority where they assume that, like Matti said, the source was Kenya, transit was Djibouti, destination was, say, Finland. And if Kenya is to write to Finland and say, under exchange of information, we need to see this trawler that was registered in your country, how much fish has it reported? But because there's no record, there's no beneficial ownership, even exchange of information becomes really, really difficult to be able to get going forward. So I have 3 books with me I want to show you. And I think if you read these books, you will really have a strong understanding of the way in which international tax rules are actually abused going forward. So the first one is by Obermeyer and Obermeyer. It's this one. Can you see it? Oh dear. Can you see it?
Sorry, unfortunately, your background is blurring it.
My background is crap. Great, sorry. Can you see it now? Again?
It's
Oh,
still there. We always see, at least I have seen Panama, the Panama Papers.
Yeah, now you see it,
Okay,
right?
yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yes, now we do.
This is a really good one. This one. And then my favorite. And don't ask me to lend them to you. I will never do it. But I can give you hints. So this is amazing. I think when I read this book, I learned so much more about the illicit financial flows. So it's very bad people. And it gives you a lot of information about different countries, from Sierra Leone to Bangladesh to Angola to, I don't know. I mean, if you look at the table of contents, it speaks about the borders, right? What happened in Cambodia? What happened in Bangladesh? What happened in Angola? What happened in DRC? What happened in Cote d'Ivoire? I mean, it's so, you read this, you get so angry, and you ask yourself, I mean, how can our leaders not see what the global north is actually doing to us by abusing international tax rules? So this one is a must read. So I said this is my favorite. This was my favorite in 2018. My 2018 favorite. Now, my 2020 favorite is this one. I love this book. You must read it. It's Taxtopia, and it's written by the rebel accountant. This is somebody who worked for one of the big accounting and auditing firms. He doesn't want to be disclosed who he is, because the information that he gives you in this book is so destructive. He speaks about Lewis Hamilton, whom I really liked until he started dating Kim Kardashian of all people. And then you find out that, he's implicated here. And David Beckham, Messi, Ronaldo, the King. And then if you're a fan of James Bond's movies, yeah, like, you read about James Bond and the amount of money that they made at the billboard office. And then when it came to the tax, they were basically not taxed. Instead, the British government reimbursed them some money that they spent on making the movie, because of a condition in British law saying that if you make a movie that promotes British culture, you get tax rebates. I mean, they made billions in James Bond's movies, and yet the British government ended up giving them a lot in tax rebates. Is actually funny. And then it also talks to you about the way in which language matters in international tax law and also domestic tax law, and the way in which we draft our income tax provisions. We've got to be very careful with them, because there's a way in which ambiguity creeps in that makes things very complicated going forward. So these 3 books I would heavily recommend. They're really good, pastime, not just pastime, but it gives you so much of rich information that you will never see tax the same way. And then lastly, before I open it up to you guys, is that question that the tea woman, our Afshin, started asking about illicit financial flows. So Afshin, the November conversation at the UN Framework Convention is where they talked about illicit financial flows, and then there was that entire debate around are we focusing on the commercial part, or are we taking everything that is illicit around it? So now, if you look at the January 2022 draft that is there, and I've pulled it out, let me read it. Let me see if I can freaking hell, where did it go? Sorry, 1 minute, kindly. Where is it now? I just had it here, like, oh, I hate this computer. Yeah, here. There. So now if you see, the definition is actually changed, hey? Now, they're not just referring to illicit financial flows, they're speaking about tax-related illicit financial flows, and then tax avoidance and tax evasion. And that's a really big win because many countries in the global north have fought against including tax avoidance in any conversation related to global tax rules because, according to them, tax avoidance is legal. I mean, if you read some of the income tax acts that we have globally, pick any, you will see that there are certain provisions that permit legal ways in which you can not avoid, that you can minimize your tax payments. That is what is referred to as tax avoidance. You know, the language is what the lawyers will say, what the tax analysts will say is tax planning, right? Tax planning is legal and it is a form of tax avoidance. But to have that language captured in this draft, it's a big win for Africa. But like I said, if we go back in August, we look at Article 7, I don't know if they're going to change this article going forward because this article reads, the state party shall develop. And I love that because the language here is mandatory compared to other languages where they've been saying may. Here they're saying shall develop and implement measures to combat tax-related illicit financial flows. Now, the problem is we need to have a definition section that tells us what really are tax-related illicit financial flows. Because according to the Global North, for example, and other countries, tax-related IFFs is trade mispricing or false invoicing. But tax-related IFFs is beyond that. So we are going to have contention, right, in terms of defining what these tax-related IFFs are. And they say, including effective tools for the detection and prevention of tax-related IFFs enforced through MAC and EOI and any other agreed forms of international cooperation to ensure effective taxation of income and profits from tax-related IFFs. Now, what about AI-related IFFs? I think that's one thing I'm going to go and raise there. But as you can see, the conversation from November has changed in January. So let's watch this space to see what they will come up with in August and then in November. And then finally, what I want to say is that, you see, Matti told us that there's this conversation around illicit financial flows. And now some people are referring to it as illicit finance. But we also have base erosion and profit shifting, right? So sometimes it is the lawyers or the drafts people that make simple matters very, very complicated. I like the term base erosion and profit shifting. It makes very good sense if we're only thinking about this within the commercial context and within international tax rules. But I also understand the historicity and the political economy around how tax evasion and avoidance and aggressive tax planning takes place. And sometimes the coinage of BEPS does not really encompass it all. So that is why when you read the high-level panel report, which is known as the Mbeki report, they have really emphasized that the language we as Africans and the Global South should adopt is illicit financial flows. So I want to make this clear. You see, when you think about BEPS as the doctor, yeah, who diagnoses the disease. Oh my goodness, sorry, I have to cut this call. Yeah, what was I saying? Doctor. Yeah, so BEPS is basically like a doctor who goes and identifies the disease, but he only treats the symptoms that the richest patients get, to acknowledge. But IFFs, you need to see it as the patient who is screaming that the entire body is sick, right? So BEPS is base erosion, profit shifting. That is the OECD's framework for addressing aggressive tax avoidance by multinational corporations. And of course, in our lecture, we talked about the 15 different action points, the global minimum tax, CBCR, which is country by country reporting, and of course, a lot of very sophisticated technical rules. It is not nothing, but BEPS was designed by wealthy countries for wealthy countries. And the solutions it offers, it reflects the interests of capital exporting states. So now source countries, and when I say source countries, it's always the global south. It's Africa, right? Where value is actually generated, where the fish are caught, where the minerals are extracted, where the users of of various platforms are. We got a seat at the table very late and a very small portion of what was served. And therefore, BEPS does not, in as much as the coinage is very unique and it makes sense to a tax lawyer in terms of the commercial aspects, that it's okay. But when you look at it in terms of when was Africa brought the conversation in defining and coining the language around BEPS, we weren't there. So why should we accept a terminology that was given to us when we didn't have a chance to give input into it? So then illicit financial flows, in as much as the word I there means illicit, and that of course can be problematic if we're going to be strict positivists, right? We're going to be the Hartian lawyers here, and we say, according to John Austin of the positive school, illicit is illicit, and it cannot be part of tax-related, base erosion. But IFFs is the broader political economy concept that says the problem that we are having is not just poorly designed tax rules, because that's what Europe is saying. Your laws are bad, don't complain. Yeah, but we're saying IFFs is not because we have poorly designed tax rules. The problem is that the system that was created historically during the colonial period, and of course deliberately, it was created, the tax system that we have, to move value from the global south to the global north through tax abuse, yeah, but also through corruption, through criminal flows, through what is this thing, trade misinvoicing, and increasingly also from digital opacity. So IFF, it names the totality of that entire extraction. BEPS, it only names that part that OECD members were politically willing to fix. And the only damn thing they were willing to fix was basically the notion of harmful tax incentives and how to prevent that, because that's where they got enough data and estimates to show that even harmful tax incentives as part of this BEPS package was getting Europe to even lose more than 720 billion euros annually because of this problem. So then that's the critical difference, right? So people will say BEPS and they'll be very, very forceful about it. Others will say illicit and they'll be beaten down about it because they'll say, IFF, the word illicit is problematic, but IFF is a justice claim. Right. So, of course, this is my my own personal opinion. You may agree with it, you may disagree with it, but I just wanted to highlight it for you that when you're having these discussions about illicit financial flows and about BEPS, you need to be able to weigh the arguments and the scholarly analysis around this very clearly. And now you're also seeing, right, that compromise is happening. Before, certain countries did not want to hear about illicit financial flows, but now they're okay with tax-related illicit financial flows. But then we are going back to the problematic drawing board. What are tax-related illicit financial flows? And somebody will tell you, of course, trade misinvoicing, and that's it. But there are other ways in which tax-related IFFs are happening. They're also happening from the construction of APAs, advanced price agreements. They're happening because of transfer pricing. Why are these not included as part of tax-related IFFs? So that's the fight that we're going to have, and we're going to have it until, I don't know, maybe Jesus comes back. Yeah. So now over to you in terms of any questions that you have. Don't ask me about the cat. I know Afshin wants to ask me about the cat. I'm not saying nothing. Anyone? Okay, just keep laughing. That's fine. You will laugh when you see that exam. Or you will cry.
Uh, what's the mode? How would you want us to have it?
Pardon, what do you mean by habit?
The cut. I mean, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't understand your question.
I presume you're still doing it online, no?
Oh, yeah. Um, it's going to be, let me just check. I don't want to give you false information. I think I'm releasing it on a Monday, and then you need to upload it by Wednesday. So at least you have like a full day, 2 days basically, to be able to do the questions and upload it on Google Classroom. That's the main thing. I think I'd already told Afshin and she communicated it to yourselves that please don't upload the exam using your Gmails because that's going to cause a problem for yourselves when the exams are being posted onto the portal, to collate CAT and the final exam. So make sure you use your university email and the way your names appear on the exam card because that has caused problems in the past and I don't want that, bureaucracy to deal with when we've already finished.
Yeah, that's something. Thank you.
My pleasure. Anything else, guys, or you've had enough for the day?
I mean, can we get the books?
No. I mean, you can come to my house and then read them in my library and then leave and go. But me sitting there, yo, nah. I mean, there was a time I used to lend some books to some colleagues, and then when they returned it back, you would just wonder, like, how does somebody treat a book like that, especially when it's not theirs? So the condition in which I received them back just made me realize I'm not giving my books to anyone. But Taxtopia is actually available online. Huh? You can get a soft copy, and you can read if you like soft copies. But I think you should start with Very Bad People. That one just, yeah. I think that one is going to set the stage for how you're going to be thinking like decolonial scholars going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Lennox. Anyone else? In fact, let me see. Where did it go? Uh, hmm. Mhm. Ah, yeah, Maina Kelvin. Anything on your end? Or still not in a position to vocalize?
I'm in the position now, Malimu.
Great. Great. Do you have any feedback, any questions, clarifications, or are we good?
Thank you for the class. I think it was quite informative. And I've even come across something that would have somewhat fallen under the illicit financial flows, because I was dealing with a case within the western part of Kenya, where somebody was actually getting what we call fish maws, and we were exporting them to China, and we didn't have any data regarding that fish maws. And there was an aspect of trade misinvoicing. So that was quite informative on my part.
Yeah.
My question then will also follow is how can we get your book, your recent book?
Oh, no, it's not yet published. So it's just gone to the publisher for like formatting, proofreading, and all. But once it's ready, I'll definitely make a copy available.
Thank you, Mwalimu.
My pleasure. Great. And then here, Dr. Callistus Wekesa. I'd like to hear your voice. Are you a doctor in terms of a PhD or doctor medicine? No response. Okay. Gone up. And how about Rushmi Matete?
Yes, I am here.
Yes, dear.
I really enjoyed today's class. I think it was very along my line of interest, even beyond school as a decolonized thinker.
Awesome.
Yeah, so I think all the questions that I would have had, my specific question was about either the source state or the transit state claiming the tax from the illicit financial flows. But I think that was explained to by you, especially as you just put illicit financial flows in the context of international tax law. So thank you for that understanding. I'm going to tell everyone about it and how they should be aware.
Vigilant, absolutely. I think there was a time a student got in touch, and one of you, and they basically said that, oh, international tax law is so difficult. I didn't know it was going to be so complex, and I want to drop the class, but we've had so many interactions. Can I go into a different elective, blah, blah, blah. And I was just like, why do you find it so difficult? Like, what's difficult about it? Is it that we engaged at a very high level, or the concepts that we were teaching were not broken down well? Because it's a master's class, right? So the assumption is not that I'm going to come and teach basic level international tax law, because some of these things are supposed to be studied at the undergraduate level. So when you come at the master's level, we're dealing with complexity. So, I mean, after the student told me that, I really sat down to reflect, and I said, maybe I should have this conversation with yourselves, because it's also good feedback for me for the next class that I run on, in terms of, should I like start at a very basic level and then build towards it, or just start at the level as we did and we go ahead, because it's a specialized course. It's at the master's level, so the expectation is the students who are coming for this course already have the background information to be able to now contextualize and build it forward. So I don't know, what are your reactions to support the next cohort in terms of the design of the course? Maybe I can hear from Michelle Ngima. Or Mitchell. Sorry if I pronounced the names wrong. Okay, Mitchell Ngima doesn't want to engage. How about Evans Ndimba?
Hi, Prof.
Hi.
In terms of redesigning the course for the next cohort, there's nothing more that I think one can do in terms of changing the expectation that this is a master's class, and that there's a general expectation that at the very least the students ought to have some level of foundational knowledge in terms of tax practice. I mean, if I speak for myself, it's because, let's say, I don't find that the concepts that you articulate or teach in the class are difficult, either because over years it's what we've interacted with at a professional level. But I still think that the design of the course is the best compared to the module, the way the other modules are taught. I still think that there is a lot of emphasis in terms of transmission of knowledge on your part, which is commendable, and that you still teach international tax law, complex as it is, in what I normally call, you teach it as though you're talking to Samantha aged 6, and that makes the whole course relatable. And I'm more encouraged when I hear colleagues relate what you teach to what they actually practice. And what's even more encouraging is that this is the only module that I can safely say that we do have guest speakers who are coming in to teach with from a comparative analysis perspective, and the fact that even in the Q&A aspects of the lectures that you offer, you do give opportunities for us to interact and to relay our concrete experiences. And so at a personal level, I do not know the level at which my colleagues are, but international tax planning is something that is very close to my heart. It is something that I interact with regularly in the course of advisories and in the course of structures and in the course of many other things. But I'd like also colleagues to understand that if they want to project themselves as though they have a certain competence and a certain skill set, particularly in commercial law or international commercial law, then I do not see how any aspects of that can articulately be said to be complete when one is not properly grounded in aspects of international tax. Certainly, on my part, there are still certain aspects of international tax that, for the sake of progressing the class, so that it doesn't turn into an academic debate, there are still certain aspects of it that are still not very well settled. I'm still, and I did want to ask the question when we started as to whether or not there is an aspect of international tax law that has crystallized into customary international law, whether we do see opinio juris or state practice in any of the things. And I like listening to your perspectives in every aspect of tax law, because where I sit on the opposite side of where you sit as a policymaker. And I sit and I listen and I have to deal with tax from the perspective of commerce and from the perspective of making business decisions. And whereas I acknowledge that, there are aspects of practice that are illicit, there are aspects of transactions that are a sham and things like that. What's also very clear to me is that there's a huge pool of practitioners who still seek good to advance business objectives. And so it is still what we are paid to do, to find the most tax efficient way for multinationals to operate across jurisdictions in ways that make commercial sense to owners of international businesses and things like this. So it's always a helpful conversation. But there's also the other side of the coin, where there's also the view of those who are not heard, and their businesses perhaps unwittingly may be deemed or considered to be illicit. And I do remember when as a country a challenge was made against the DTA between Kenya and Mauritius, and it threw completely our professional competence out of the wood, because few elements that had used the DTA for round tripping ended up legitimately obfuscating and putting legitimate business interests at risk, because that DTA is a lot more useful. And some of these jurisdictions, we choose them not specifically because they are low tax jurisdictions or are considered tax havens, but we do choose them also because they offer certain other strategic advantages that we intentionally don't have in a jurisdiction like Kenya. And sometimes some of us are shy when we consider some of these tax jurisdictions as though they are gray, but in actual fact, if you have a multinational that operates in a dual legal system, both English and Anglophone, then you've got only one jurisdiction that I know of that embraces both jurisdiction harmoniously. Okay, where you can have aspects of an Anglophone jurisdiction coupled together with aspects of a Francophone jurisdiction. And so looking for that jurisdiction in terms of neutrality and seats and competence of arbitrations, because tax goes hand in hand together with insolvency. It goes hand in hand together with how progressive some of those company laws are. And so the danger that I constantly come across is, let's say, when we hive off tax as just one aspect, and we end up not articulating some of the structural benefits that one can get when you go to some of these jurisdictions, that they genuinely offer structures that are incomparable to what you and I are normally used to in this jurisdiction. And so there's a lot of stigma that comes with when you're in this space of international tax planning, and the stigma that is associated, because you tend to get or find people always thinking that you are this very sophisticated professional in these extremely sleek suits, and all you do is you kind of help the multinationals with your professional competence to come up with the rules that that help them avoid the obligations towards the taxing states. And it's an ongoing conversation. And there is no right or wrong answer. But from a business perspective, and for me as a Kenyan, every time I have to structure an operation, and I have to think of where I have to domicile, let's say the holding, in a way that I can also protect the international investors from the vagaries that come with the reality of hosting it in a country, an emerging market like ours. Sadly, those are the realities that we face. And when I compare the advantages that we can offer comprehensively as against some of these jurisdictions that we assess primarily based on whether or not they are like a lower taxation jurisdiction for which complex rules of transfer pricing should apply. At a practical perspective, I do also I do think that there's some tangible benefit if we step aside from the whole conversation and think that which is the best way that we can genuinely incentivize some of those multinationals to bring the operations in Kenya, because we are competing against Morocco. We are competing against Egypt. We are competing now against Angola. And that is the reality. And so when I think that, why should I convince a high net worth individual to set up the operations in Kenya as opposed to setting up the operations in Tanzania? And if I have to think of, at the end of the day, which is the easiest way for them to repatriate their dividends in a tax-efficient manner, and I have to sit and comb through 1,000,001 DTAs that each of these countries has, not just between the operating state and where I warehouse the business, but ultimately, which is the other corresponding DTA that they have, then you see the search narrows it down, quite frankly, to a few jurisdictions. across the world. Whether those jurisdictions are used for, or rather they are tainted reputationally, because historically they've been used, let's say, by international business people who had acquired their wealth one or the other. Must it prevent us from exploiting some of these countries that offer the so-called tax advantages? It's the only thing they have. And my encouragement, even as we look at all these things from a tax perspective, from a policy point of view, let us always remember that India has become what it is economically, precisely because India has encouraged third-party or contract manufacturing between itself and all those multinationals operating out of America and are warehoused in Ireland, but they do allow their manufacturing business to be outsourced to India and to be outsourced to China and to be outsourced to Hong Kong. And so we can cut our faces to spite we can cut our noses to spite our faces. But from where I sit as a very patriotic citizen, I do think that whatever it is that I can do to encourage foreign investment to get here, because they won't get here unless also there are certain guarantees that we can offer. And if we are not prepared to offer those guarantees, someone else will. And if someone else offers those guarantees, the inevitable consequence is that our manufacturing base remains narrow. So anyway, from a practical point of view and from my own perspective, Doc, I can only thank you for opening up the conversation. The only thing I will say is that there's another perspective to the whole taxation question, and it's always an issue of, so long as it is not evasion, for so long as it amounts to legitimate schemes to enable you to operate efficiently, what can we do to ensure that those business people are able to structure the operations in a manner that enables them to warehouse the operations here? And there's a huge opportunity. We must not make the environment less friendly. We can always do it better. I agree that we need to trap as much value within our jurisdiction. But always remember that if we don't do it, and experience teaches us that certainly they will definitely go to Morocco. Definitely they are going to Mozambique. Definitely they're going to Angola. And we cannot compete. And we cannot compete because we are dissuading them. We are dissuading them. So that's my personal story. That's how I view it every day. And to encourage us always to distinguish between what is legitimate and what is illicit. And if it is legitimate, then we must not shy away as patriotic citizens from structuring international operations in a manner that will deliver long-term benefits to our country, because we can only grow our economy to the extent that we can attract foreign investments. And that's just my view.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving us the context around the way in which you're seeing how international business taxation law has actually shaped up, and how you're linking that to economic growth, economic performance, and FDI going forward, which should also generate in job creation. And you gave us good examples of India, but then also look at Singapore. Before Singapore became this economic giant, and even the United States, before they became this, world leader in terms of the economy, they did something that, we call a self-preservation, right? They closed off their markets against FDI, and they wanted to build investment nationally before they opened up their borders for foreign companies from Europe, from China, from Singapore coming into the United States. So that level of thinking is also very important. And as much as, yes, international tax rules should work both ways to generate revenue for the state and to also create an enabling environment for multinational corporations. And I like that you brought about high net worth individuals to find a country, giving them some incentives to bring their money in for purposes of investment. We need to also, strengthen our economy first against all the loopholes and the leakages that get the state to lose that revenue in the first place. So the model that the US began with, the model that Singapore and even China have taken, to protect the economy before opening it up to FDI, and even, high net worth individuals coming to now invest is really, really important going forward. And if you get a chance to read the work by Leonce Ndikumana, I think he's a Burundian professor who's now in the United States. And his book really goes on to show that this argument that many scholars, including yourself, Timba, and to me to some extent, that we have been making, that's very important. You need to have a very preferential tax regime to be able to attract FDI. And Dikumana and Alan Lumba in his book in Monetary Authorities, they actually contradict that. And they say, the tax system, no matter how it is, it's not the main justifying feature or component of FDI, because FDI looks at so much more things like political stability, the cultural relativity within the economy that they're coming into. So as we're having this discussion, it shows that also tax law is multidisciplinary. We understand tax from the business perspective. We have to understand tax from the local community perspective. We also have to understand it from the regional perspective of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So there's so much richness in just getting to study about international taxation going forward. And I really like the fact, Dimba, that you brought about this aspect of customary law and whether there has been some jus cogens or state practice that has emanated as a result of international tax law. And I love that. So the last class we're going to be having, which is on nexus jurisdiction and jurisdiction, and how it's basically transforming in the age of artificial intelligence and, artificial general intelligence going forward. I'll be able to tackle this part about customary law in that lecture. So I'll find time to, update those slides so that we can have this discussion going really well. And the last thing I also wanted to say, what we need to be alive to, is that international tax law, in as much as we speak about it, right, we need to be able to tie it to human rights and also labor laws. And I like the example, Dimba, that you gave us of India allowing its marketplace, where multinational corporations, especially from the US and Ireland, are able to come and, pump their FDI into that country for purposes of them, like in China, for example, making the iPhone and then shipping it back, or like Louis Vuitton going to Bangladesh and asking them to make the bag. Yeah, which they basically pay the person who's actually developed the entire bag in itself less than $2 for it. And then it goes to Italy. And under the EU laws, they basically say the last piece of material or the last piece of advancement done on a product that is pre-finished, you can give it your own rate in your last country, the destination country. So Bangladesh has come up with the purse, the Louis Vuitton bag, the way it is. It goes to Italy, and the Italian just puts a zip on it. Yeah. And what the price was in Bangladesh for the Louis Vuitton bag, maybe under $30, is now priced at $3,000 in Italy. So if we don't tie the concept of international tax law to human rights and labor law, we will continue to see the way in which international tax law continues to embed income, wealth, inequality within the global north and the global south. So, like I said, positivist lawyers would always think about international taxation from the perspective of this is how business is done, this is what we need to do, and the state needs to take a step back and just regulate its fiscal space. Now, if you become a law and development thinker, you're going to look at international tax law very differently. If you are a sociological thinker or a legal pluralist thinker, you begin to think about international tax law very differently. So this is it for yourselves. You have to sit back and you have to ask yourselves, yes, international tax rule is technical. There are rules. We must respect them. They must be applied. And of course, the rules must generate sufficient income and revenue for our countries, but at the same time, create an attractive market space so that we're not losing our investments to Morocco or even Mauritius, yeah, because it's also becoming a very important destination going forward. So then how do we do this in a context that's going to protect our economy, our politics, our human rights, our youth, our employment standards? How is it going to help finance sustainable development goals? Because the conversation around international tax law is a conversation about the fiscal contract, right? And that fiscal contract continues to either become strong in the way in which state and society relationships are being built, or it continues to be destroyed piecemeal. And I really feel that with the way in which artificial intelligence has come in, to the fact that certain companies are now setting up themselves simply as algorithm trading companies, it's completely destroyed our entire understanding about the applicability of transfer pricing going forward, and also the tax rules that are applicable, and how that is going to now go around to shape the discussion around Protocol 1. Because even at the UN, they're not thinking about the hybridity levels that are being brought about because of artificial intelligence. And it's going to play an impact, especially when the AI agents are out. And these AI agents, they are going to be so autonomous that they would be trading on our stock exchange market without human knowledge. The only thing you'll be seeing is that you have an agent who you have contracted through this AI company. You're simply seeing dividends coming into your bank account, but you don't know where they're coming from, how they are, how they have been derived from which jurisdiction, because the agent is doing the work, some autonomous entity. If you watched the Mission Impossible, the last Mission Impossible of Tom Cruise, when he gets to actually see the person who's been sending him messages, it's actually the AI machine, right? Like a proper human being. So are we ready for that system? Are we thinking about that system in the way in which law is going to react? How technology governance specialists are going to come about and conceptualize this space for us? So even as we finish this class, yeah, after the last class on nexus and jurisdiction, these conversations must continue in your mind when you're at work and you're looking at contracts before yourself. Ask yourself, we're tired of this standard boilerplate clauses, simply get a template and push it forward. Even the DTAs get a template, push it forward. But how are we now looking at the language when we read some of these DTAs, when we read some of the bilateral investment treaties, when we go back and read our Income Tax Act? Are we going to see the language, right, the words that we're reading the same now? Or are we going to start questioning the historicity of these words, the ambiguity around it, the colonial framework that built these words? It becomes really important, because only then, once you go out into the world of international tax law and you're sitting at the OECD or the United Nations, only then can we come up with rules and norms and principles. And what Dimba said, that customary law that begins to make meaningful sense for us going forward. So I think I've really, really loved the class today, because it's given me a lot to think about, and also to try and see if I can get somebody called Professor Stephen Dean from Boston University to join us, because he wrote this book on global Jim Crow. And in this particular book, he basically shows you, or rather he describes how global tax rules are embedded in racism. And his argument is that tax law is racist law. And I think to have him come and explain that and show that would be really ideal for us. I cannot guarantee that he would say yes because the time zone, he's in the US and normally he teaches in the morning, which would then be our evening time. So if we're able to get him, excellent. If we don't, we can always find another way to grab him during the November discussions at the UNFs, all that in Nairobi, when they're coming to discuss the final part of the treaty drafting. So I think I will also stop here. Yes, anyone else?
Yeah. So, Prof, for the benefit of the next cohort,
yes,
and from a practical perspective, and I'm only saying this because I haven't seen any module that tries to offer it in depth, but I feel that it's an area that there's some technical upgrade that is needed in terms of tax law. So all these things that we discuss about tax law and how they impact you and I on a daily basis, and whether or not we are able to transfer this skill and build the next cohort of professionals who are able to champion all these policy considerations in tax law.
Okay.
So one area that that perhaps you may consider,
absolutely,
one area that you may consider to expand for maybe the next cohort is there's a lot of interplay between international tax law and industrialization, because industrial growth, and particularly what you're describing a short while ago, the relationship between international tax law and certain aspects of international investment law, and how business kind of shapes taxation policies and the future of free trade in terms of free movement of capital and people, and whether or not tax law should respond or keep pace with these other rules that you're alluding to about product creation in countries like Bangladesh. So when you then look at the future of trade, or in future of globalization or economic growth, from the perspective of incentives that have worked, special economic zones in America, in Ireland, in China to a very large extent, it is these policies that are impacting international taxation. And along with those policies, certain rules of international trade regarding rules of origin and things like this. So from my point of view, and from my own practical experience, and how international tax law becomes something that I relate to, is when I have to design a free trade zone, for example, as opposed to a free trade area within a special economic zone, and the difference in terms of the two concepts. And when you interact with your apex policymakers like KRA, and these are concepts that unfortunately in this country are still very new. These are things that not many people understand. But you're now completely dealing in an area that involves international tax law, but from a domestic perspective, because a special economic zone is a geographical territory that is deemed to be outside the customs union of a country. And so typical rules of international tax law kick in and apply. And in my understanding and experience dealing and operationalizing some special economic zones, and dealing specifically with policymakers in this country and elsewhere, mostly in this country, you do realize that there's a little bit that is lost. There's a huge technical gap that exists. And so maybe for the benefit of the next cohort, one of the modules that you may consider to include are also the impact of these zones, how they relate to international taxation, and the interdisciplinary nature of international tax law and international investment law, at least in the context of law and development, specifically in the areas of special economic zones.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Actually gotten very good feedback from you and how to basically go and add some more topics around our course to show this interrelationship. So that's excellent. I really, really appreciate that and thank you very much. Is there anybody else that would like to contribute? I suppose maybe if I can call upon Margaret Andeso. How about Joyce Korir?
But I don't have much to say. Thank you for the awesome lecture, and it was really a nice discussion with today's guests. And yeah, just say thank you. I don't have much to say.
I'm most obliged. Thank you very much. Naomi Chebet, I saw that you kept dropping off, coming back in. You must have had a lot of internet difficulties today.
Good evening. I'm really sorry for the same. I was attending a conference, the ICS annual conference. So there was that distraction and the internet was keeping on and off. And yeah, I'm really sorry, but I managed to settle at last.
Well, the good thing is that I have recorded this lecture, so you can actually get to watch the recording later.
Yes, and the presentation was insightful.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And then maybe Tiongo Nganga, if I can hear from you, and then if anybody else, we can close the class. Yes, dear.
Brief in the interest of time. We have a significant proportion of Kenyan revenue that organizations, and some of the money is not reaching Kenya. It's being transferred from Switzerland to other accounts. I don't know whether these financial flows amount to be illicit. Conversation on email, because it's been a long day for everyone, and whether money that's destined for Kenya, for instance, the Eurobond accounts, is subject to remedial tax. We do know that there's the and financial flows, which are meant to be used in the public sector. I'll send you an email and we can continue with the discussion on that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute.
I'm most obliged, please. I look forward to receiving that email because I wasn't able to hear you very clearly with the audio. But I mean, it's a very important question that you've asked because the first part tackles around remittances, and then the second one is around the sovereign debt issues that are brought in and whether that is part and parcel of international tax law going forward. So once you send me your question, I'll go through it, and then during the next class, I'll be able to answer it in detail because I think it's very important, and we really need to have a discussion on the same. And that could be something I can even consider updating the course with, because I've got like enough points to do. But that's great. So I know it's already getting to 8:30, and we're tired, but I hope that you've gotten enough to be able to sit with, discuss with amongst yourselves, by yourselves as well when you're having tea, and to really think about the way in which you perceive international tax law and the kind of philosophy that international tax law builds for you, what are the principles and the norms that you appreciate about international tax law, and what are going to be the main challenges that you foresee that need to be overcome. So think through that, because that's what the critical thinking about reform within international tax law is actually about. So thank you very much for staying until this time. I think by the schedule, we're supposed to stay till 8:30, so we're not really out of time. And I thank you so much for engaging last week with Nick and this week with Matti. We'll try and see if we can get Stephen next week. If not, we're going to run our own lecture around multinational corporations and corporate structures and how these corporate structures create this entire ambiguity and opacity around making profits invisible. So the entire BEPS through the design of corporate structures. We're going to have a lecture on that. And I think we have 3 more lectures left. So that's the 30th of April. Then we have, I think, the 7th and the 14th of May, after which you go for your exams, which are beginning the 18th of May. So until then, let's meet on Thursday and have a good night. Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
You're welcome. Collins, I'm going to upload the recording on Google Classroom. I'll do that just now for you guys. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.